Mack Weldon is better than whatever you're wearing right now. Now, I don't wear Mack Weldon because I'm a girl, but my husband does. And I'm going to tell you the best thing about it isn't how great it feels. It's this magic technology they have that keeps it from stinking, basically. It's antimicrobial, whatever it is. What it does is keep my husband from smelling for longer than he might naturally, and that keeps us from fighting about who's going to do the laundry. And we get to focus on more important things we want to fight about, like, WikiLeaks. Mack Weldon believes in smart design, premium fabrics, and simple shopping. And if my husband can do it, trust me, you can do it too. It is the most comfortable underwear, socks, shirts, undershirts, hoodies, and sweatpants that you will ever wear. They want you to be comfortable, so if you don't like the first pair, you can keep it and they will still refund you. No questions asked. And not only does Mack Weldon's underwear, socks, and shirts look good, they perform well too. They're good for working out, they're good for wearing around the house, they're good for whatever you want to do. Sleeping in them, for instance. I kind of like that part. Now go to MackWeldon.com and get 20% off your first order using the promo code FRIENDS. Again, that's FRIENDS, like the show. MackWeldon.com and 20% off your order using the code FRIENDS. Hi, I'm Anna Marie Cox, and you are listening to With Friends Like These, a podcast about uncomfortable conversations, some of which are more uncomfortable than others. This one's relatively comfortable, like new jeans uncomfortable. It's with my friend and friend of the pod, Rick Wilson, who calls himself a Republican troublemaker. And then in the second part of the show, we'll loop in my colleague Jane Coateson, who is a writer and reporter at MTV News. And in that section, we're going to tackle an audience question about violence and when it's appropriate. Now, the show. You are Rick Wilson, Republican troublemaker, friend of the pod. Ad maker, you were just telling me you have some ads you're working on right now. Can you talk about them at all? Do we get a preview?
I can't really talk about them. Well, a couple of them are some off-year election stuff, but those aren't really that interesting. And the ones that are interesting, I can't talk about. But you'll be seeing them in the next week or two.
Well, that's the story of your life, isn't it? The interesting stuff you can't talk about.
Pretty much. It's a frequent problem that I have.
Because your background, in addition to being a Republican operative, you worked in the Pentagon, as I recall. Is that correct?
I worked at the Pentagon for 4 years during when this guy named Dick Cheney, who you may have heard of, was the Secretary of Defense. So that's part of why I have a kind of interesting background that isn't just the normal Republican guy out doing campaign stuff.
Mm-hmm. And it puts you in a uniquely, perhaps, informed position to talk about what's going on in the American political scene right now. I think it does.
I generally tend to agree with that. I know a little bit more, and I have a wider circle of acquaintance on those areas than the average dog, as I like to say.
Well, let's just start there, just sort of get some news out of the way. This latest WikiLeaks dump, which seems to have reminded some people that WikiLeaks is sometimes the bad guy. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I mean, WikiLeaks is an adjunct of the GRU, Russian military intelligence. They work for them. They are completely owned by them. Julian Assange has this little fig leaf where he says, "Oh, I didn't get this from the Russians." Well, he has a pass-through, obviously, at some point where he gets it from the Russians. This is stuff that happens from state actors, as a general rule, not from random
the 400-pound
hacker.
Yeah, right.
Right. So, and obviously, you look at WikiLeaks, and it's interesting that not even a tiny fraction of the stuff that they leak out there has anything to do with Putin or the Russians or human rights abuses in Russia and the invasions of countries surrounding Russia's borders and the vast apparatus that Putin has built to surveil and oppress his people. So, the deductive reasoning isn't that hard to look at who really runs the show. I mean, Julian Assange is the classic sort of front player in this new version of the old song we used to see from the Soviets all the time of quote-unquote peace groups springing up, across the world, strangely always opposing the U.S. and never opposing the Russians. So, it's an old story. And you've got to remember, Putin was a lifetime Chekist. He was a lifetime spy and a member of the former KGB. And this is a guy who's this is wired into his DNA, and this kind of politically disruptive shenanigan he tried to pull this year is wired into the DNA of Russia's overseas attempts to discredit and to diminish the power of the U.S. and to make Russia more of a player on the world stage.
Now, you've worked in both intelligence and in opposition research, which makes you probably more conspiratorially minded than most, I would think. So let's just use that for a second. What do you think of the timing of this dump? I mean, just coming as you have...
Well, it was structured... Yeah, oh, no, listen, they have a very keen understanding of the post-truth media landscape in this country. And they recognized there was a news hook in there that would allow the lunatics, and it would percolate up from the fever swamp side of InfoWars and Breitbart and and Gateway Pundit, all the kooks. And that one news hook in there was to say, oh, this was the CIA secretly making it look like the Russians were hacking Trump. It's the inside deep state trying to get to Donald. And they knew that hook would be there, and it sure enough is. And by now, it's percolated up through that system, and now it's got Sean Hannity saying, obviously WikiLeaks has proven that the CIA was behind hacking Trump, and this wasn't the Russians at all. And it's, of course, complete batshit lunacy. But these people will buy anything at all if they say this helps Donald Trump. This is to help protect Trump. This is part of the people who oppose Trump will do anything. Right. And we are in a very strongly post-truth environment, and these guys have absolutely no qualms about both exploiting that to achieve the Russian state ends, and to pushing our democracy into a very deep and dark hole where we've become divided not only on the ideological stuff, which we've always sort of had, but now there's a deeper sense of that's emerging, I think, in Trump world, the sort of post regard for democratic norms and for civil society in a way that is challenging and dangerous for this country.
And of course, that's where you and I agree. But I kind of want to exploit sort of this perhaps narrow ground of our agreement, which you have danced upon in the past few months, right? Like you're one of the left's favorite people on the right. You are an incredibly popular never Trump person because of your background and experience, and also you have a very clever way with words. You were always a speed dial for reporters in Washington looking for a quippy quote. But I also wonder, so your background, as I mentioned before, is both kind of spooky stuff and oppo, which is in its own way a kind of spook endeavor. And you specialized in attack ads, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, a lot of folks on the right have said, "Oh, well, Wilson's got all these new friends on the left. Strange new respect." The thing about the situation is, I haven't changed my beliefs. I haven't changed who I am. I think there's just a weird moment of common ground about a threat that's bigger than a lot of the lanes we've been in ideologically in this country for a very long time.
And that's easy. I can agree with you right away. But I'm also really curious because, those attack ads that you did, like you've done some really infamous ones. You did a Jeremiah Wright ad at the closing days of 2008 that
the original
Jeremiah Wright ad that seemed to punch a lot of fear and hate buttons. I don't think you can argue with that. You did an ad that was regarded by many on the left as one of the most despicable ads of the modern era, which was an ad about against Max Cleland, Georgia Senator Max Cleland, a paraplegic, 3-time amputee veteran that used a montage of images to question his firmness on battling terrorists.
See, that's interesting because that's one of the things that people really they sort of have the demonology of that ad in their head. And really, the images up front, all that did was frame what was facing the country. The actual thing that we know from testing that took out Cleland was the list of the votes, because he was out there on the stump saying, "I'm with George Bush 100%. We're going to protect this country." and he was holding up votes about and by the
Okay.
way, we can always look back in hindsight. He was holding up votes about the Department of Homeland Security because he wanted it to be unionized, and so we rang his bell on that ad. But if you ask a lot of Democrats, they'll say, "Oh, that was the ad where Wilson put a turban on Max Cleland. He made him look like Bin Laden. He morphed him into the." Nothing of the sort happened in the ad.
Okay, well,
And
now, Rick, you know what you were doing. Like, you know the power of
of course,
images.
I know what I was doing.
Like, you know the way that images work on a brain in an attack ad. Like, you're not surprised that was the read by some people of that ad.
Listen, I'm not surprised by it, but I also didn't set out to make something that was going to have my guy, who was 17 points back, end up being one of the few U.S. Senate races in the country that didn't win.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do anything in that ad that questioned Max Cleland's patriotism. I didn't do anything in that ad that wasn't factual. And that's the ball game.
That's where I want to drill
the
down.
The other side will go after my folks and say, John Smith wants to kill your father-in-law, or your aged elder mother. John Smith wants poor people to eat dirt by the side of the road. I mean, we all play these games. We all push hard. It is a full contact sport all the time.
Uh-huh.
And I don't expect the other side to show any mercy on my side, and vice versa. Now, are there boundary layers that we stay out of? Sure. I've never brought up another candidate's kids.
Mm.
Even when I could have. I try never to get into a candidate's personal life stuff like divorces and things, because all these weird human tragedies that amateurs think are effective frequently aren't.
Mm. So that's not a moral judgment. That's just a professional judgment.
It's both. I see no reason. It has the advantage of being the right thing to do, as well as being the effective thing to do.
That sounds...
A great negative ad tells you something about the other person that you already knew and that you already sensed. Look, in the world of opposition research, there are very, very few silver bullets, but there are patterns of behavior you can illustrate that make an ad effective.
Well, but I kind of want to drill down on this idea that you didn't bend the truth for that Max Cleland ad, which I'm sure that is the case in a literal sense. But I wonder, when you look back on the attack ads you've done, especially the incredibly effective ones, which do play upon people's existing fears and biases, right? That's the nature of a good attack ad on the left or the right. Do you see a connection between attack ads and those becoming kind of a dominant strain of a political discourse and the fact that we're living in this post-truth era? When you play upon people's fears and biases, even in a subconscious way, are you setting the world up for someone to...
I think actually what set the world up for that is that we've developed these two competing media ecosystems where on the right for years and years and years, we said things like, if only we got a fair hearing, the power of conservative ideas would be so overwhelming. If only we could get through this filter that liberal mainstream media has put up against us. Okay? So instead of trying to create an actual media enterprise that got those ideas out, we decided to build in the form of Fox and Rush, and at its high point now, at its absolute peak of the shit mountain, is Breitbart.
Right.
Where they didn't decide to build a competing news thing, they decided they were going to build a funhouse mirror version of the worst excesses of the liberal mainstream media cliche. Okay, so that became very powerful, and it was popular, and it was monetized very successfully in the form of Fox and talk radio, and those things have become the definitional sort of post-truth vectors on the right, and the remnants of conservative media are chasing these ever wilder stories to try to get them clicks, and on the left there's a similar ecosystem and a similar sort of cultural. Both sides have a kind of hermetic cultural little bubble they're increasingly living in, and they don't know people on the other side of the fence. They don't talk to people on the other side of the fence. They don't compete on ideas anymore. It's just competing on volume and firepower.
Well, you've hit upon the whole purpose of this show, so I thank you for that. which is to sort of try and have conversations with people on the other side of the fence. I wonder, there is a little bit of that happening in general. There was a trend story in the New York Times, actually, over the weekend that mentioned this very show, as well as some other attempts by basically the MSM, the mainstream media and liberal media, to do at least sociological research, if not actual bubble bursting. You know, as someone who is a red stater, right, born and bred, you are one of the people that can be stereotyped, right? Your likes and dislikes, your cultural sensibilities. You're a Trump voter by culture, if not actual support, I would say, for the profile. What do you think of those outreaches? They must seem a little condescending.
Well, look, I think.
I hope you don't feel condescended to by coming on the show, but like we'll accept this project, of course. But
not at all.
Yeah.
And look, if you were to take the normal demographic profile of a 53-year-old guy who hunts, loves guns, drives a pickup truck, and lives in North Florida, I mean, I think I'm probably about as rare as a goddamn unicorn. Okay, everybody else in that demo, no matter their education level or whatever, almost certainly voted for Donald Trump.
Right.
And I think on the left it would be productive for them to talk to folks that are outside of their hermetic bubble, and vice versa. But I mean, I will tell you, and this is the dirty little secret. It's free advice for the Democrats, and this would be so easy for them, and they don't get it. They'll flip out when they hear this advice. Drop the gun control shit, and they could win back those voters in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio, because those guys, those white male voters, those union guys, those guys who drive pickup trucks, in many, many ways, they're Democrats, culturally, behaviorally, everything else. They're union workers. They're lower middle class. One of the number one things you heard in focus groups 1,000 times from those guys is, I'm a deer hunter. I'm sick of this goddamn lectures from these people like Hillary Clinton. It would be something if Democrats would just reconfigure on that. And I know it's a matter of their the center of their identity. Those are why you lost those people, and there is a certain degree to which they feel talked down to, they feel insulted. Now, in some ways, honest answer, they often deserve to be checked. Both on the left and right, there are people that deserve to be checked. But they were sold a cultural differential on things like guns and religion, and NASCAR and all these things that they feel like they're despised for and looked down on. And look, on the other side of the fence, it's not every Democrat, not every liberal is a tofu eating, transgender, third world music listening Brooklyn hipster.
Statistically, very few of them could be, really.
Yes, exactly. But we're in an era though where I think the outreach, there's a really weird narrow line I think on the right where some people say, we've got to listen to these folks who are the disadvantaged, and they've been left behind, they've been ignored, they've been dissed, all these things. Well, there's also some tough love that ought to be given to those people. And it's not all because brown people came from Mexico and took your job. It's not all because the evil George Soros killed your coal mine. It's not all because there's some Washington, D.C. conspiracy to blow up the fact that in the old days a guy could get a high school education and raise 4 kids and buy a house in the suburb and have a bass boat. The world changes, and a lot of messaging on my side has been telling those people, it's okay, no, it's not good. We're going to change it back. We're going to convert it back to what it was, because these folks that think we're going to go back to the 1950s and it's going to be a white industrial American dream part 2. They're telling a comfortable lie to people who have been economically distressed by a changing world. And I know that my version of tough love is saying, it wasn't George Soros who took your job. It was technology. It wasn't Barack Obama who killed your coal mine. It was natural gas. All these things that people they accepted the comfortable lie because it was a great lie told by a great liar.
And also it plugged into existing fears and biases, right? I mean, robots took their jobs, but, there aren't pictures of robots crossing the border, right? There aren't images of robots committing crimes on Fox News. There's images of brown people.
And the I cannot emphasize enough the amplification factor of Fox News on the right. It used to be, and look, I admire what Rupert built as a business and what Roger built as a business, but it has become something that has exceeded all control. It has become something that is mutated and metastasized into a much different creature than it was before, and it becomes this agenda-setting ecosystem of Fox News, talk radio, the online outlets that have increasingly dominated the quote news space, and I use that term very, very lightly. And of course the big social media ecosystem that surrounds all of it now. Fox is still the blowtorch of which there is no rival in terms of changing American political discourse.
I want to drill down a little bit on something you said, though. We'll get back to media, but you were talking about what the Democrats could do to appeal to Trump voters, and you mentioned guns specifically, which we'll get into in our next segment with Jane Coateson. But because I think they actually might. You may actually be onto something there. So there's two things about that are interesting to me. One is that you didn't mention abortion, but let's come back to that. The second one is you're not really endorsing the kind of forced anthropological project that some people are engaging in, self-included, which is that listening tour that seems to be going on right now. All you're saying is just change your fucking policy so that people in red states can get with you. You're not saying there needs to be the kumbaya moment. You're saying just do something that they'll actually like.
I'm kind of a reductionist on these things. And I want to get to the X. I want to get to the goal line on things like this. And the anthropology is fascinating. And as a numbers guy and a guy who likes to look at long reports, the numbers are very interesting, and that study is very interesting. But I think as a kind of guy who bridges a lot of different cultural worlds, I'm perfectly comfortable in the hunt field, and I'm perfectly comfortable talking to people about more elevated blah, blah, blah.
You probably don't say blah, blah, blah then, but yeah.
Probably not. Generally, no. But, look, the mystery of human nature is not so, in this case, although no one can know all the secrets of the human heart, human behavior is kind of explicable. And we kind of understand where a lot of these things come from. And we understand what feeds them and these issues. And it isn't so much, in my view, a sense of lower middle class white folks feeling like they've been called racist a billion times. They have been called racist a billion times, and they are sick of it. But that's not the underpinning driver. The underpinning driver is this anxiety about change and about the world whipping past them so fast that they don't understand what's going on. Where these certitudes and these certainties that they had for generations are now gone. This is from a while ago, but we were doing a focus group in Wisconsin a few years ago, and this guy just broke down in tears. He had voted for George Bush twice and for Barack Obama once. Okay, and he said, I don't get the world. I don't get it. My grandfather did the same job at the Ford plant that my dad did and that I was supposed to do, and now I'm fucked. Now I have nothing because the plant closed, right? And these guys felt like there was a consistency and a continuum about the world around them, and it's gone. And that's what's driving so much of this with these folks, because they're clinging to a sort of dream of the American middle class that isn't there anymore. They're rocked constantly by increasing not just the amount of change, but the rate of the change. And the world feels very uncertain. They're clinging to things that they want to really hold on to. And Barack Obama wasn't, when he said clinging to guns and religion, he actually touched something that in his normal smart way he didn't get. He was contemptuous of it. And I think that was a really terrible moment for him. And it's almost catalyzed a lot of these people out there who aren't ashamed of their guns and religion. And you can't make them ashamed of it. And they don't.
But he wasn't wrong.
He wasn't wrong that they're doing that, but he was wrong in the way he approached it with them, and he was wrong in some of the reasons they're doing it. See, he thinks it's because they're that they love guns and they're worshiping their primitive sky god.
Rick.
But they're using it as a mechanism to control the anxiety and the fear they have about change.
So you just went on this very lovely kind of empathetic monologue about these people, and then you just sunk right back into stereotyping and dismissing Obama because you know that's not what he thinks. Like, you know, I don't want to argue about this, but like, it's just fascinating to me that you could do something like pretty, you know, like being very generous to these people. I do want to ask you if you really think it's just economic anxiety, as they say. But you know, Obama's a person of faith and like doesn't think of the sky god. It doesn't dismiss the sky god. Like,
I am, if nothing else, a smartass.
Okay. And you just relaxed back into like sort of the same kinds of like jokes that like anyone on the right would make, which I get, and like I can make them too about you know, as a person on the left, like I can joke about the, you know, war on women or whatever.
I think the context of where he made that remark, you know, it had all these confluences in when and how he made that remark at, you know, a fundraiser in San Francisco and all that. It just sort of it was sort of a perfect storm. I think he probably does regret saying that, by the way.
Oh, I think he regrets it, but I also don't think that was a completely cynical thing to say. But I don't want to argue about what Obama was or wasn't thinking.
Sure.
I do kind of want to get back to a couple things, and that's, was your disquisition there a longer version of the they're just suffering from economic anxiety line that we heard pundits use? Because I know also you're very aware of the entrenched, you know, racial anxiety on the right as well.
Oh, look, listen, here's the thing. And I've told my friends on the right this for a long time. So as a guy raised in the South, the journey is long and arduous and slow, and it is full of imperfections and twists and turns. But if you're not aware that there is still racism in this country, you're a damn fool. And if you deny that it exists completely, you're operating off of an agenda, not a acknowledgement of the history of this country. It doesn't mean that, you know, it's like the spectrum of you get the Klan on one side of this thing, and the people that genuinely don't consciously ever engage in racist behavior, or who genuinely don't, you know, partly because they don't interact with a lot of African Americans or people of other races. And a lot of those people have felt like they've been lumped into the, you know, if you don't favor reparations, you're with the Klan. They feel like that, and it's a rough spot to be in. But denying the fact that there has been racial stress in this country for generations, centuries, and denying that is a damn fool thing. And I think that one of the big problems on the right at the moment is Trump has, in the slipstream of his campaign and his behavior, moved and normalized a lot of these people who aren't just dumbass fat guys in white hoods burning a cross in the middle of the night, but who are more sophisticated purveyors of modern day racism, and who really would love to see, you know, the white homeland version of America. And frankly, I think they're the most dangerous aspect of American society today, by leaps and bounds.
And that is why you have engaged on this narrow strip of common ground. I know that you have with the left. What do you think we should be doing? You know, we can go on each other's talk shows and talk about the dangers here. We can talk about how terrible this is. We can talk about the alt-right, and we can talk about Steve Bannon's white nationalism. And we can talk about the way that, you know, this tiny group of people has played upon a less virulent strain of racism among the larger population in order and parlay that into immense power where they can enact actual white nationalist policies.
Yes.
That's what's happening.
And
but you were the ad guy, you were the campaign guy, you're the guy, you know, information warrior or disinformation warrior. What do we do?
Here's the main part of it. You have to elect people of goodwill. On the right, you have to elect people who haven't followed this particular anti-intellectual fashion down into the white nationalist rabbit hole. And that's going to be tough for a while. Because right now, the theme of everybody is, I'm Lil Trump. I mean, these candidates are coming up in the next election cycle, and a lot of them are terrified of their own base. So they're gonna excuse and follow the ball on every Trump excess, and some of them are going to nod and wink at we're stopping those brown people from coming over our borders, and that's a hard assignment. I mean, right now, I'm normally a fairly optimistic guy. I'm never out of the fight. I'm always leaning in and pushing forward. But I do think that Trumpism has reshaped the Republican Party in a lot of ways. And if we're not very, very careful, it's going to reshape the Republican Party to have a whole bunch of guys who believe things like Steve Bannon does. And right now, that is by no means the majority in the House or the Senate, and by no means even a meaningful fraction of the House and the Senate. Maybe a little more in the House than the Senate, but it is a risk, and it is a risk that I think is bordering on existential for what the Republican Party means as a conservative if it continues. So I think I don't have I wish I had a 1-2-3 solution that would walk back the White House policy direction and the tone and the flavor and the attitude that has been stoking some of these things. And the other part of it is, look, the long path in America of integration and moving ourselves out of purely racial lanes, we have known since before slavery, or since before the Civil War, that the artifacts of slavery were going to take generations and generations to work through our system. Like I said, I wish I had a hand wave that I could tell you, here's my brilliant idea to fix this, but I don't. So,
well, let me make it a little more short term and concrete, which is that I think you're right that candidates we're going to see coming up in the GOP are going to be Trump bets, and the people that are not new are going to be scared of Trump and therefore make themselves a little more Trumpy.
Mm-hmm.
What does this mean for you as a potential voter or as someone who makes choices about candidates? Would you be willing to support a Democratic candidate that was going to hold Trump's feet to the fire over a Republican candidate that was going to roll over?
Well, I can say this: I have never voted for a Democratic candidate in my long ass life, and I don't know that I'm going to find myself in that situation yet. But there's a real question of how much longer. You see, I voted for Republicans not because I was a Republican, but because I was a conservative, and I believe in free markets, and I believe in free individual liberty, and I believe in the Constitution. Now, all those three things right now are no longer characteristics of Donald Trump's policy and ideology. Mm-hmm. He is a crony capitalist of the highest possible order, and frankly, as an example, this undoing of Obamacare that he is pushing this week. I'm no fan of Obamacare. I think it had some good heart in it, but it was a disaster from a whole bunch of implementation perspectives and caused all these unintended consequences. But the bill he's doing now, a friend of mine who is a healthcare policy expert, and I'm not one, said to me, he said, this is just a slightly different set of rewards for slightly different groups in pharma and slightly different groups in the insurance industry.
And very different groups in the American citizenry.
Yes, and yes, right, with a set of disastrous consequences, I think, in ways. And look, was there some other solution to reducing healthcare costs and increasing coverage? I'm sure there was. I'm sure Obamacare, I'm positive Obamacare was not done out of hostility or malice, but it was done in a way that it still had to take care of all these competing Washington interests, and so it's a train wreck. Mm-hmm. So it's a big old mess.
I would say that it's ugly, but it's not a wreck. But what you're saying here, let's move it back to the main point here, which is that I agree that this monstrosity that they've said is the replacement does embody a lot of the worst of post-Trump GOP ideas, right. And that's what I'm trying to make you say how dedicated are you?
Yeah, let me say this back to your question. I voted for Republicans because they were the conservative party. We were the conservatives in the field, and so I believe in free markets. we now have a president who bullies companies, screams at them, wants to impose massively higher tariffs and restrictions on the way businesses operate in the free market. If Barack Obama picked winners and losers and it was wrong, Donald Trump picking winners and losers is fill in the blank now, Republicans, and I believe in individual liberty, which I depart from some of my Republican brethren on this, but I believe that a lot of your rights are rights to be left the fuck alone. And I do not believe that you will have a guy like this who is rapidly and massively expanding the state, rapidly and massively expanding federal law enforcement powers, and one day it's going to be the brown people getting off airplanes, and the next day it's going to be your papers, please, because these kind of things always metastasize. They always grow faster than you think. They always have to expand the circle of people they surveil and people they seek to control. So I'm kind of wondering where the individual liberty part of the Trump universe comes in, because I don't hear anything. The guy doesn't use phrases like liberty or freedom. He is a statist and an authoritarian in waiting, so I don't see a lot of hope in that regard. And look, I believe in fiscal probity and fiscal sanity, and this is a guy proposing $1 trillion for an infrastructure bill and $1 trillion child care program and $1 trillion here and there. And I think we all know that Donald Trump's view of meeting financial obligations is looser than most of us. And so look, if you end up in a situation where you have a fiscally conservative Democrat and a authoritarian Republican, we'll see. A lot of it depends on the people in question. But I've reached the point where party loyalty has been tested and strained to the breaking point. For me in particular, and I think for a number of Republicans, and I think there is a large. It's not quite a majority. It's not a majority inside the Republican Party, but there's a large cohort in the Republican Party that look at Trump and worry every day, is this what I believe? Is this what I bought for? Is this what I paid for?
Yeah. I think, I hope you speak for other Republicans. I know it's going to be, the midterms will be a clarifying moment for us. And you know what? It seems to me that both parties need to be out there, recruiting the best candidates. And Rick, do you know what service they might use to recruit candidates? I'm going to tell you.
You can tell me.
Go ahead. It's ZipRecruiter, Rick. Are you hiring? ZipRecruiter.
ZipRecruiter, the employment sourcing system?
That's right.
ZipRecruiter.
That is right. If you are hiring, do you know where to post your job to find the best candidates? Post your job in the one place. It isn't enough to find quality candidates. If you want to find the perfect hire, you need to post your job on all job sites. And now you can. With ZipRecruiter, you can post to 200 plus job sites, including social media networks like Facebook and Twitter, all with a single click. I know that must appeal to any kind of conservative. People want to conserve their own energy, for instance. And you can find candidates in any city or industry nationwide, maybe even politics. Just post once and watch your qualified candidates roll into ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use interface. No juggling emails or calls to your office. Quickly screen candidates, which is something you know about. Rate them and hire the right person fast. Find out why ZipRecruiter has been used by Fortune 100 companies and thousands of small and medium-sized businesses. And right now, my listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/friends. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/friends. I'm going to say it one more time for the slower folks in the audience. ZipRecruiter.com/friends. And we're going to take a short break. I'll be right back with both Rick and my colleague Jane Coaston will join us for a conversation about this shared territory that we might be finding as Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives.
You're listening to With Friends Like These with Anna Marie Cox.
Welcome back to With Friends Like These. I am Anna Marie Cox. We are talking to Rick Wilson, Republican troublemaker. And joining our conversation is Jane Coaston, my colleague at MTV News, where she is a writer and reporter. Hi, Jane.
Hello. How are you doing?
We are, well, we just had, of course, a not very cheering conversation, but we're going to go with something even darker now. These are dark days. We are going to attempt to grapple with a question from a listener, Justin Hendricks, who sent in a question that seems it was relevant the day he sent it. It's probably going to remain relevant. And here it is.
So one of the things I'm worried about is seeing protests turn violent. And I've been having some back and forth with people on Twitter about when is it okay for protesters to become violent. We're going to see in the next few months probably some horrific things happening with immigrants being detained, being deported, being ripped from their families. And so the pressure is going to be on for protests in the streets to figure out how to deal with that. And I don't know what the right answer is. I believe in nonviolence. I believe in nonviolent protests. And yet it's not my door that's going to get knocked down.
So, guys, I want to be clear. I don't think Justin is asking about the kind of violence that happened, let's say, at Berkeley when Milo Get Your Yayas Out was going to speak. I don't think he's talking about like rioting for rioting's sake. I think, at the end there, he brings up the fact that, we are facing a government that seems willing to turn to pretty extreme means in order to enforce some authoritarian, I was going to say fairly authoritarian, but let's say in order to enforce some authoritarian policies. And Rick, I'm interested in your perspective on this because this is the thing that, the right has been warning us about for years when we've had a Democrat president, right?
Yeah, I know a lot of guys on the right who believed that was coming and that Barack Obama's goons under Jade Helm or whatever other conspiracy were going to kick down their door, take their guns, and put them in FEMA camps. And there was a formulation that I always found very troubling as a guy who loves to shoot, loves guns, but these guys with "Vote from the Rooftops" T-shirts, that used to exist on my side. Suddenly, now that the state is authoritarian in a direction that they like, they're suddenly quiet again. They're suddenly happy again, and I find that concerning because I do think in the broader, deeper kind of question of when is violence acceptable against state power. Look, our founders believed that violence was acceptable against state power if its state power had become tyrannical and oppressive. They built that into our political DNA in this country. And so the real question is, except for the Civil War and a couple of tiny little, brush fires here and there in our country, it's never reached that point. And are we there now? Certainly not. But I think that the American tradition and the American recognition that government can become so tyrannical that it cannot be borne is something that we need to keep in mind. I mean, there's a shorter version of that phrase, and you always have to ask yourself where you are on a certain spectrum, and that spectrum is somewhere between too late to work inside the system, and on the other end of it is too soon to start shooting motherfuckers. Somewhere in there, is kind of where we feel like right now. I don't think you're going to see, because of the political impetus on the part of Bannon and others, they want this tension in the country. They want this fear factor built in the country that we're under imminent threat, and so therefore any excess of state power is acceptable and necessary.
Now, Jane brings a somewhat different perspective to this, but I know that there's some of what Rick is saying that you agree with.
Right, definitely. I remember joking pretty soon, kind of after inauguration, like what was going to happen to all those people who fundraised off of Barack Obama seizing a third term through martial law. And I hope those fundraisers are going well for them. But yeah, I think that, and it's interesting because I think that we talk about kind of an authoritarian response to protests, but we've seen that again and again. I've actually spent a great deal of past weeks going through the FBI's COINTELPRO documents with how they were going after both the Black Panthers, civil rights groups, and the KKK, and all of which they were doing through the lens of none of this is properly American. One of the major plans that they used against the Klan in the late 60s was to send postcards to the homes of members of the Klan saying, "We know you're members of the Klan, but your neighbors wouldn't want to know. You wouldn't want your neighbors to know because that would make you look bad and make you look less American." But it had nothing to do with the fact that being in the Klan is in itself bad. It's that you wouldn't want other people to know you were in the Klan because that would make you look bad at, like, Tupperware parties. But, yeah, I think that the challenge, for years we've responded to legitimate and illegitimate concerns regarding our country's future with violence or with curtailing the rights of people. When
you mean the government has responded to that? The government has responded to those threats.
When the Black Panthers were like, oh, we can use open carry in California, California under then Republican Governor Ronald Reagan responded with the Mann Act, which banned open carry. And it had nothing to do with, other people having guns openly. It had to do with the fact that the Black Panthers were holding rifles and walking around the state legislature, and people got scared because apparently that was scary. So I think that we have to remember that, like, this isn't new. And I do agree with Rick's point that it is very interesting to me that suddenly the same people who were very concerned about, like, who's the Milwaukee sheriff who said that we needed to take pitchforks to Washington, who's the same person now just demanding that we all...
Dave Clark.
Yeah.
David Clark.
Yes, exactly. Now there's the person demanding that we all adhere to Trump's regime.
Right. Well, and also we might be seeing a repeat of the Black Panther move because I sent you guys both a story that appeared recently in the Post, which was about how gun sales are actually down because the people on Rick's side, sorry, Rick, but the people on the right are like, whew, Donald Trump won't take my guns. I don't need to stock up. And the people, but there is a group for whom gun sales are up, and that is people of color and other minorities.
Right.
God, I love the Second Amendment.
Well, I think that's something, I think Anna and I, we've talked about this a little bit, and I've written about kind of the racist history of gun control, but there have been, kind of history of people, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells both said, you have to have a gun because that's the only way to protect against these motherfuckers. And I think that you saw that even in San Francisco in the late 1960s, where LGBT people were like, well, we're dealing with a heavily Catholic police force that will do nothing if we are murdered, so we have to do it ourselves, that kind of fags bash back concept. And so I think that that's going to be really interesting because I think that, when we saw with the Philando Castile case, and we've seen again and again, it's that when African Americans and other minorities use their Second Amendment rights or don't, or, are holding an unarmed gun in a Walmart or may have something in their pocket that might look like a gun, even in an open carry state, that carries a weight of suspicion that it doesn't have when you're, a white guy going to a Chipotle on open carry day in Texas.
And Rick, are you just like popping your popcorn here and cheering, or what do you think? I mean, I think you probably you endorse this reaction on some level.
I absolutely endorse this reaction. You know why? An armed society is a polite society, and the differentials are what makes people show their ass when it comes to firearms. And I know this sounds a little colder, but deterrence works, and deterrence is important. And so the 5'0" woman who may have a Glock 19 in her handbag, there is a deterrent factor from whoever is going to try to go and carjack her. And the fact of the matter is that you're correct that police look at armed African Americans in a totally different light than armed white suburbanites, and unfortunately, that hasn't really percolated through police training yet. That law-abiding African Americans have every goddamn right in the world to carry a firearm, pending state and local law. Okay. And a lot of police departments have not trained their people appropriately on that, and they need to. And frankly, for the vast majority of people who own firearms in this country, of every race, are responsible firearms owners. And that's just, if they weren't, given the number of guns in this country, this place would look like Raqqa, but it doesn't.
Rick, oh God, I've never heard that point made before, that we should be having, I mean, considering that how many firearms deaths there are, most of them self-inflicted. Yep. I've never heard the argument that we should, the reason you can tell that gun owners are responsible is that more people aren't dying. That's That's bold. That's a bold statement. And I have to jump in here with I'm of two minds. There is a part of me, and I can tell you exactly which part. It's the Texan. It's the Texan part of me that looks at this and sort of feels the same way that I think you both do, which is that right on, let's show those motherfuckers. You know, what does the NRA do when the masses of people of color join, right? Like, what do they do when the people who they've been boogeymanning, you know, show up in the parade? And I find that fairly delicious. And then there's the troubling part of it, which is that we all seem to be agreeing that this might be actually a prudent move, which is should scare the fucking shit out of everyone after you stop, like, you know, thinking it's amusing. And then there's the I hate to bring facts into discussion, but I'm going to, which is that, you know, having more guns around actually does lead to more people using them. And we do have an epidemic of gun suicide in this country. And, you know, physicians have said that this is a violent, you know, it's a community disease issue and a health issue. And so I worry that if we arm up and we are living in this climate of fear, which, as you pointed out, Rick, Steve Bannon is stoking, you know, maybe what happens is not politeness, but we start shooting at each other.
Right. And I think that kind of...
Well, look, I mean...
I want to hear what Jane... I'm going to hear what Jane has to say.
Go ahead.
I think that there's a sense that, you know, like minorities arming themselves, I think that really says something about the fact that minorities better than anyone else know that, you know, if something goes wrong, the government's probably not going to be on our side, especially not this government. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not going to be, you know, it's always interesting to me when people are, you know, we're so worried about, like, you know, the FBA or the DOJ taking over something, and now they're like, now Trump's like, oh, bring in the feds to Chicago, and everyone's like, oh, okay, that sounds great. Mm-hmm. I think that for a lot of people, we've long known, and I think that there's a cultural history of minorities recognizing that when things go down, the government probably isn't where you're going to want to put all your trust. And I think that that's something, it's interesting, because I recently watched the PBS documentary about the Oklahoma City bombing, and you see so much anti-government paranoia from so many people for whom the government poses no real danger. And yet for a lot of Americans, especially with kind of Jeff Sessions as AG, who's saying that, oh, the Chicago, you know, the DOJ's research into Chicago is based on anecdotes, but he didn't actually read it, so he doesn't really know. You know, when you have a government that seems set up to tell people that, you know, police misconduct is okay and that Blue Lives Matter, you know, you're seeing a lot of people who are saying the same thing, that, oh, we can't trust the government. The problem is that having all people agree that you can't trust the government is not the goal here. The goal here is to have a better run and more effective government.
Right. And Rick, honestly, if a black man celebrates open carry at Chipotle, or if there starts to be, you know, Black Lives Matters embraces the idea of arming themselves. I mean, come on, like these are your people on the other side of the fence. How do you think they react to that? I mean, I'm not confident things end well.
Listen, I have to tell you, you have to separate out two parts of this. One is folks who use, carry, appreciate, hunt, shoot.
My father, actually. Case, I mean, my friends, I have friends and family. I know they're out there. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. In that case, it's going to make zero difference. I mean, look, I like to say that in society there have been a couple of big wars, big social wars over the years, and conservatives lost the war on marijuana and they won the war on guns. And so I think that there will not be a huge backlash or a panic or escalating violence. I mean, look, if gun sales were going to increase the rates of violent crimes in this country, then the last 8 years we'd be raucous, because gun sales have been enormous in the last 8 years. But I think that it is incumbent upon law enforcement as agents of the state who are allowed to kill you if they feel threatened, to recognize that the Second Amendment applies to everybody across the board. And
Right.
if you were a legal gun owner and carrier behaving legally, you should have zero differential in whether you're an African American carrying legally or a white suburbanite carrying legally. If you're carrying legally, you've got to be treated with respect by the state, and that's the law. Now, will that happen? Nah, we're going to see some places where that is less evenly applied.
And Philando Castile is the vivid example here. And, Rick, why hasn't the NRA taken up the cause of Philando Castile?
I can't speak to that one in particular. I do know the NRA does have an outreach to African Americans. I do know that they have repeatedly talked about that in the last few years. I don't view the NRA as stereotypically as a lot of folks do. Some of these are my people. I get them. And they really do look at this as a universal and colorblind right.
Well, I think that looking at the NRA's history, I think that there was definitely a shift once the NRA offices moved in the mid-'70s, where the shift definitely went from talking to sportsmen and sportswomen to talking about self-defense generally in a world in which every black guy is going to try and carjack you. But I think that another point I'd like to raise specifically about kind of gun rights and perceptions of guns has to go with, I know I've talked about this a million times. I think I'll go to my grave talking about it. But I think one of the major issues here, again, is residential segregation. And I think the perception of why you own a gun is very different based on not just what you look like, but where you live. I talked to Charles C.W. Cook. He's at National Review about this a couple of months ago. But we talked about how, if you live in a city, you are less likely to own a gun for the purposes of hunting. If you live in the country, you are less likely to own a gun for, say, the purposes of protection or something you would carry in your handbag because you are worried about something happening to you on the streets. And I think that the perceptions of why people would own guns shape, when a lot of people in rural areas are terrified of cities, and a lot of people in cities think that rural areas are backwards. You have that really goes to how people perceive why and how people own guns and use guns as well. Because I think that you saw, even right after the Philando Castile case, there were a lot of he's got a concealed carry permit, but why does he really have a concealed carry permit? Because,
right.
Why would you possibly need that why would you need that? Of course, he's allowed to have it, he can have it. And I think that we see that, we see kind of ulterior motives being placed upon people because we live in such separated and segmented such segmented lives that we can't see why someone else would make a decision that we may not make because we're in a different environment. And I think that comes back to, it's not just about guns, it's about talking about, when you have I live in Washington, D.C., I am surrounded by the federal government. I am so not concerned about the federal government taking over anything because I can see that the federal government at this point couldn't make a ham sandwich. But if you don't encounter the federal government on a daily basis, if you don't, recognize that the federal government is technically responsible for, why you can't do this or why this takes a long time to do, if you have never tried to get a permit for something, if you've never seen a friend try to get a business license, you might think that, yes, the federal government is listening to all your phone calls and is in your basement and is, secretly, trying to do something to your children or something. But I think that, it all has to do with what you're around and what you have experience of, because I think that that's really the big story here, is that there are a lot of people for whom what the federal government or what protest means it's very different depending on where you are.
Well, I think that's very true, Jane. I think that's accurate. That there are separate cultural perceptions of the threat factors that drive a lot of these decisions and the threat level of the federal government. When the federal government decides it's going to go and accomplish something or kill something, sometimes they're really good at it, and sometimes they're terrible at it. And unfortunately, they're better at it in a lot of ways. Well, maybe fortunately, not unfortunately, they're better at it in a lot of ways of killing bad guys overseas than they are of putting you in FEMA camps, which is the sort of Alex Jones version of the federal government. Thank God.
But we can't rely on the federal government's incompetence. That's actually sort of where I come down on this. I think Jane has a point, but I think that's maybe what
Yeah,
you're going to say too.
I think that point's, look, the federal government is slow, inefficient, clumsy, and unfortunately it also weighs 1 trillion pounds, and once it moves to do something, it often does it unsubtly and stupidly.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as a conservative, I am always wary of the power of the state over its people. Always. And if you're not wary about it, then you rethink your predicates as a conservative in this country.
Right. And I think that's been one of I've written a lot about, I write for MTV about the GOP and about the right, and I think that's been my biggest concern, is that people have stopped being concerned about the state, so to speak, and started more being like, well, what can I get the state to do for me?
Which is, and I'm never going to get tired of pointing out that people on the right seem to forget that there's a socialist part of National Socialist, right? And we should be just as worried about that, and we should be just as worried about the license that voters seem to be granting the government to move on those things that they themselves are scared of, and that fear overpowers any other constraint they might place on the government.
Right.
Now we've all agreed. So so I actually just want to bring back, before we close, because we're running out of time, although I think we could all talk for longer, to come back to this guy's question about violence, when is it appropriate? Maybe I'll turn, Rick, to your formulation, which is that, if you could state it again, what was it about when is too early and too late?
Too late to work inside the system and too soon to start killing motherfuckers.
So where are we on that? And let's get a consensus. Where are we on that spectrum?
I think we're somewhat too late to work within the system that Bannon and Trump are building.
Mm-hmm. But it's still too soon. Let's be very clear. Still too soon.
By a long stretch, way too soon.
Okay. And Jane?
Right. And I would agree with that, mostly because it seems as if Bannon, I think one of my favorite things about this current administration, and by favorite, I mean only thing tethering me to existence, is that they still have to deal with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, both of whom seem to think that they're all playing the same game of chess, even though Stephen Bannon's version of chess is to flip the board over and set it on fire. Mm. They're still trying to help play within the old rules of what this looks like. Paul Ryan still wants a better way, and Mitch McConnell still wants everyone to calm down and let them just get back to Kentucky. And I think that, it's the system that's attempting to be created by both Trump and Bannon is being created by people who have bragged for so long about being outsiders, and it turns out that you need a couple of insiders to know what they're doing in order to do it. Mm. And even what we're seeing on Trump Care, what we're seeing on just kind of various issues, where clearly no one actually knew what they were doing or how to do it, and then a federal judge could be like, "Come on, guys, this is ridiculous." Mm. I think if the system created by Stephen Bannon were to exist in the real world as they want it to, and I think it's on its way, but I think it's taking a lot longer than as expected because of what I was mentioning. I think it is a little too late, but it's definitely too early for, killing people. I am glad that we've all settled on that. My personal feeling is about in the same area. I do think, hey, guys, if you, again, the Texan in me is saying it's never too late to explore the joys of gun ownership. It is fun to shoot things, not necessarily live, but, if you are interested, get educated. Let's put it that way. And we'll keep tabs on it, right? Unfortunately, hopefully, you always know when it's too late, but we'll just keep our eyes and ears open. Thank you both for joining the podcast.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right. I was talking to, and is still enjoying talking to, Jane Coateson, my colleague at MTV News, where she does write about the GOP and conservative issues, among other things, and Rick Wilson, Republican troublemaker and reluctant friend of the pod.
Hardly reluctant.
Please, if you enjoyed this podcast, go rate it and review it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We drop on Fridays, so look for another one next week, although that will be guest hosted by my friend Jamil Smith. I will be on vacation. Thanks again, guys, for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And that's it for the show. I'm Anna Marie Cox. You have been listening to With Friends Like These. If you have a question like Justin did that you would like the pod to tackle, you can email your MP3 to withfriendslikepod@gmail.com. You can also send your questions and comments that way. You can also tweet at us at crooked_friends. on Twitter. I'm working on a Facebook page. I do value your feedback, and I do especially value people who are grappling with the issue of friendships and politics in their own lives and want to hear more from people like you and any audio or text questions you might have. Again, this has been With Friends Like These, a podcast about uncomfortable conversations. Join us next week.